Welcome back to Biz Talk. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sticking with us here during this episode. I am Rick Gutierrez. I'm your host and your business advocate, and I've got an amazing guest who we are going to be hearing from here shortly. He is a mastermind, or Mr. Cybersecurity, as I like to call him. He is our expert when it comes to everything that has to do with strengthening your cybersecurity and keeping your network secure and all of those amazing things. So, Greg Schaefer, welcome back to the show.
Happy to be back, Rick.
Yeah, it's good to have you. I think we always have a great conversation. You educate us quite a bit every time that we have these conversations because, cybersecurity is completely different from IT. I get that, so many people confuse them. They think that if they have IT, they're good with cybersecurity and all those good things. So we are going to showcase not only your expertise, but also educate those folks that think that if they just have an in-house IT person, that is all good. And so we want to talk a little bit about that. And, it's for small and mid-sized, but obviously large corporations, it's a huge deal for them as well. So what do you say we get into that conversation?
Let's do it.
All right. So strengthening cybersecurity resilience for small and mid-sized businesses, I mentioned, is the conversation, is the topic. Greg, I mean, you work with so many different businesses from small to medium, right? Businesses often don't have some of those resources like large enterprises, have, and they invest in cybersecurity. What are some of the most effective budget-friendly strategies that you recommend to help those businesses protect themselves from cybersecurity threats?
Rick, it all really always boils down to focusing on the basics. And really, what is the basics here? We're talking about information security is securing information by its name. And you can't secure the information if you don't know where it's at. So one of the first things that I emphasize, this costs nothing but a little bit of time, is inventory your information. Understand what you have and where it is, and also understand which aspects of that information, what would be considered confidential or critical for your business, and what would be considered maybe public information like the website or something like that. But then you can apply, once you know where your confidential information is, you can apply controls to protect it, and that's really it comes to the next step is you want to know who has access to this information. So you need to be reviewing your users, who has access. Sometimes people terminate from a company, for example, and they forgot to drop their account. Or sometimes people within the company, they have more access than they really need. Again, that's a no-cost way to help with information security. Now, as far as something a little bit more technical, maybe follow a framework such as the CIS-18 or the NIST cybersecurity framework. You don't have to meet all the requirements of those frameworks because sometimes not all the requirements are applicable to your business. But what you do want to do is document the ones that you don't meet requirements for and why. Sometimes it's because it's not really applicable to your business at all. But sometimes it's just you have other things that you have in place to mitigate the risk associated with that.
Right.
Really, what it all boils down to is to figure out the high risks, work on those, don't get hung up on low risk issues.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. There is something that is increasingly targeting small organizations, and that's ransomware. We've all known of it for many, many years now, but it's increasingly, targeting those small organizations. It's increasing more and more as we go. So your company, vCISO Services, you guys help develop some proactive defenses, and what steps should companies take in the event of an attack?
So some of the defenses that we do is that we help prepare them. We do a ransomware tabletop, ransomware risk assessment rather, and then we'll do a tabletop exercise, which is basically we sit around a table. We talk about what happens if ransomware actually hits your system. And the reason why you want to do this is because you want to understand your risks and you want to understand how you're going to respond before it actually happens. Rick, I talk about something called triggers. And what I mean by triggers here is what is the trigger that is going to make your business pay the ransom? A lot of times businesses will say, well, we don't pay the ransom whatsoever. We're never going to pay the ransom. But but when you're faced with actually losing your information, you might have to pay the ransom no matter what.
Right.
It's just a matter of keeping your business in business. So if you're if you're hit with a ransomware attack, understand the triggers that will get you to how you're going to respond first of all, and second of all, make sure that you have contacts for your FBI or other law enforcement to get them involved as early as possible as well, because they can also help with the remediation so that you suffer less due to the ransomware.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate, but sometimes we do have to end up paying that ransom, right? So it's
Mhm.
something to but it can definitely be prevented if you have the right company that is helping you put those defenses in place so that you don't have to go through any of that. So, Greg, so cybersecurity compliance regulations are becoming more complex nowadays. How do you help businesses navigate the evolving landscape of compliance requirements?
Well, while regulations are becoming more complex, the basics, as I said in the beginning, they remain just that, the basics. And some of the complexity might be there's a new threat or a new tool out there. And I like to talk about something called generative AI when talking about the
Hmm.
new risks. So generative AI, people might know it more as like ChatGPT or Copilot. It's relatively new, been only around really out for the general public now for about 2 years. Very useful tool.
Right.
Just a lot of people use it all the time,
Hmm.
but there are risks associated with it. Now, it sounds like this ominous high mountain to climb. Like, how are we going to deal with the risks associated with generative AI? Well, it's really simple. Understand the the risks involved first, and then realize that it's going to get back to the basics. As I said before, it's all about understanding where your information is and where it
Right.
shouldn't be. That's one of the biggest risks with generative AI. Don't put your information out to a public site, and then have policies in place to massage that. Usually, for AI risks, you don't really need a some corporations will have a separate policy for it, but usually it's just adding a few lines to your corporate information security policy or acceptable use policy, and then let your users know these are the things you can do with it, these are the things you can't do with it. And these are things that the regulators are going to want to look for, because they want going to want to know that not only have you been taking care of the basics for things that you already know about, but are also responding well to the threats, the threat changes in the environment.
Right. And would you say that, certain industries like maybe healthcare or finance, would they have stricter regulations?
Oh, I would say so, absolutely. I think that finance is the most highly regulated industry, just right behind or right in front of healthcare. So, finance, you have the FFIEC, and healthcare, you have the HIPAA. And both of those, it's the same thing. If you look at those regulations and standards, they're all talking about looking at the basics as well, too. Really, the guidance, I take the FFIEC guidance for finance, for example. The guidance hasn't really changed since it came out in 2006. Even though the threats have changed, the guidance still is applicable to the evolving threats.
Yeah, no, I kind of figured that's wanted to be specific in asking that question because I think there are certain, industries that are going to have more, they're going to be a little bit trickier or more complex than others. So we've known that since COVID, since 2020, there's still a lot of people working remotely, right? And cybersecurity challenges has always been an issue for a lot of businesses. So what advice do you give to a small or mid-sized business on securing their remote workforce, and how has this shifted in cybersecurity landscape in the recent years?
Well, I think that remote users need to understand that they have to treat their workspaces if they were in the office. There are certain things that you may not think that you need to do at home, but it's even more important to do at home in some aspects. So, some simple things: keep a clean desk.
Hmm.
And what that means is don't keep confidential information on your desk. Well, yeah, the chances of somebody seeing that, I understand you're physically secure in your house. You don't really have public walking by back and forth, but it's still good to get into the habit. Same thing with your monitor. You want to make sure you're not exposing your monitor, because and don't have conversations where others can hear, because perhaps you're on a speaker conversation and nearby one of your family members is on the phone, and that information can kind of leak over as well. And then also some of the basics about the cyber part, make sure that your network is configured correctly. Your internet connection, make sure you're using a router that is up to date. We always talk about making sure your firmware is up to date. Make sure your wireless is configured correctly, and that's can be very simple, but it can also be very simple to not configure it correctly, and sometimes the bad people will get in through that. I always like it to have people have a separate network. You can do this with pretty much most of your small and home office routers nowadays. You can create like a separate network off of that for guests. You can also segment off your office equipment, or in my case, it's like I have a separate network connection for work at home, completely separate from my family's connection.
Right.
The bottom line is that, sometimes we may work in our pajamas. It's great to be able to do that, but we can't sleepwalk through security.
Right. So one of those things I was going to mention is for those small to mid-sized businesses out there that still have people working remotely, or even for large organizations. If you guys were to have Greg Schaefer and vCISO services, you guys would automatically help those remote workforce workers, with things like reminders to update their passwords every so often, so that it just stays continued with a secure, network. I would imagine that's correct, right? You guys would set up such reminders, notifications?
Well, we would help them with their security, but actually, it's interesting you brought that up, Rick. The NIST just came out with guidance where they actually recommend not changing passwords on a regular basis. They prefer
Okay.
that you have long, complex passwords and that you use multi-factor authentication and you use a password manager. You see, even the advice evolves with the threats. So.
Absolutely. So that's wonderful information. So as you can see, we're learning as we go from the experts. So Greg, we've come to the end of this segment here, but I appreciate you being here. We learned quite a bit about cybersecurity every time that you're here, so we appreciate you.
I love coming on. Thanks, Rick.
All right, my friend. All right, folks, we are going to take a quick commercial break. Stay right there. We'll be right back.